this event, and just want to encourage you guys to just listen tonight to this really important issue. I'll tell you personally why this is an important issue to me. I grew up in an engineering family. Science is important to us, and I had lots of questions growing up. I'm like, okay, God, this Bible that's 2,000 years old, and then science. Like, how do they go together? Are there answers to these questions? They were super important to me. It's not like this is a side issue in my mind. I wanted to know, is God real? Does he have something to say about physics? Does he have something to say about biology, botany? And so in the course of my own personal journey, this was a big issue. And I was super encouraged for people like Tim Anstine, other people who can give answers to these questions. So I will let Tim introduce himself here in just a little bit, but just a personal connection to our family. My son and his son are in the same class at Ambrose. His wife is Dr. Anstine, who delivered our son, and I think others in this room. Raise your hand if Dr. Anstine delivered your child. There we go. All right, so there's a connection there. And so anyway, we're really happy to have them as kind of friends and just as a great resource for this area. So let's pray and just ask God to bless this time. Father in heaven, we just want to bow before you as your creatures and just confess your amazing, creative, powerful character. And Lord, when we look at the universe, when we look at the stars and all that you have made, when we look at DNA, when we look at the molecular level and see your intelligence, Lord, we just stand in awe. And Lord, I pray that you would use this evening to help us to see it more, to appreciate who you are more, and just to worship you as a result. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Tim.
All right, thank you, Pastor. Yeah. Ha! All right. Got my notes, so we're good to go. So, yeah, right, I don't use notes, so that's all good. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm hoping tonight is actually rewarding and challenging, uplifting, but I'll just be honest with you, my number one reason for standing up here tonight is to bring glory back to God himself. I think, as we're going to see here in Romans, that his glory has been exchanged into the form of humanity, and I, for one, love doing this because it's all about him, and I want him to be glorified tonight. So thanks for coming out, and again, a little bit of a challenge. So I have to confess, a couple months ago, my wife and I sat down with the kids over Christmas break, and we kind of like to do this tradition of watching a movie and just kind of laying low on Friday. And the movie that none of us had seen was this movie, amazing documentary on philosophy and theology called Nacho Libre. Some of you have probably heard it in here, right? And so here is this movie, and I'm getting into this movie, and I'm like, this is crazy. We've got this incredible protagonist in Nacho Libre, and we've got this antagonist who never speaks a word, right? He never even says one word throughout the entire, what's his name, Ramses or something, this awesome figure. But what really struck me as amazing was the protagonist in this whole thing. And some of you might know him, and I don't speak Spanish typically, but Esqueleto, I think is the way he pronounces his name. And this Esqueleto has this amazing saying. And as we're watching this documentary, he makes this profound statement, and he says, hold on, I'm getting click happy here. I'm getting so excited. I don't believe in God. I believe in science. You guys know that line in that movie? And both my wife and I are sitting there going, oh, that's pretty profound. Why is it that there is this perceived antagonistic relationship between science and faith? Where does that come from? And for one of the things, as an organic chemist, so I have a degree in chemistry and biology, and I have a PhD in organic chemistry, so my life has been really revolved around the study of carbon, okay? I love carbon. It's a cool molecule. It's a cool atom, and we can do a lot with it. Just ask some of my organic students that I gave extra credit to come tonight, so they're all sitting here in the front row. So with that, I really wanted to break down how is it that we can have this dichotomy but also resolve it at the end of the night. You see, I think Paul was so brilliant in the way how the Holy Spirit spoke through him in Romans 1, where he says this. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth. I want that to resonate with us tonight, because one thing I really want to do is I want us to look through the lens of science and see truth. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'll lay my cards out. I don't think truth is an abstract concept. I believe truth has a face, and I believe he has a voice, and I believe he loves us. And that is the truth that Paul is talking about. He's talking about a person. In unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident. This word literally breaks down to plainly recognized. When we look through the lens of science, what Paul is telling us, we should be able to see this amazing beauty and harmony throughout the scientific realm. Not only that, but it should scream his presence. He goes on to say this: for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. So as we begin to ask this question, can we truly resolve this faith versus science? Can we really begin to bring these two realms in? One of the things that I want us to see is that this is not in a vacuum. When we have these conversations about science and faith, they come through the lens of history. And without bogging down into great historical progress from the 14th century on, we basically had these two warring ideas in the 15th and 16th century. In the 15th century, there was this rebirth. There was a finding of the classics. And in the Ambrose School, we talk about this, and we wrestle with this, and it's a fantastic subject. But in the Renaissance, you had some things coming out of the Renaissance that are very, very important for us to understand through the lens of science. And in the Reformation, we also had a different set of answers to similar questions. You see, the Reformers had their 5 solas that we just celebrated not that long ago. And one of the main solas, in fact, the main sola, was sola scriptura, the Bible alone. Through the lens of Scripture alone, do we know the way things really are? One of the things in science we constantly wrestle with is, what is the really real? And let me let you in a little secret. We don't know that from science. You see, the really real is outside of the realm of science. Well, then what is the really real? We're going to get into that. But the Renaissance, in that conversation, you're going to see the elevation of man. Man became the idol. Man became the measure. In fact, when you break these two thoughts down and we begin to bring in the science and faith realm, we see that the Reformers had this high view of God. And we see that the Renaissance began to chip away. Did God really say? Can you really trust this revelation thing? Does the Bible really bring truth to the world around? And they began to question that. And the byproduct of that was a very low view of Scripture. Whereas the Reformers said, no, sola scriptura, it's the Scripture alone. Through that lens is how we know the really real. And in that, we have this high view of man coming out of the Renaissance. In fact, when you look at this fantastic carving or this Michelangelo sculpture, the statue of David has artificially large hands, especially his right hand, and an artificially large head. And a lot of historians have said that's because that's to showcase the awesomeness of man, right? Man with his thinking and his reasoning, man with his big hands, man can do it. He just needs to be freed from the shackle of religion. We just need to get rid of this myth, the fairy tales of God. And from that, you see man emerging as the measure of all things. What does man think? What does man say? What does man define that in? And as we begin to have this switch from nominalism to this realism, we see that ultimately what happens of this, the universe is reduced to a simple machine. So now if we can just use our 5 senses to bring the machine and have a better understanding of the machine and harness the machine's power for our benefit, man gets that much better. We don't need this God myth. And so out of this, you have us in modernity coming to the 21st century going, what do we do with this? What do we do with this apparent conflict between science and faith? Are these two really at war with one another? And as believers, if we believe in Jesus as the truth, the face and the voice and the person of truth, what do we do with this thing called science? How do we wrestle with this? So tonight, before we get started, I want to define a couple terms. I think in a night like this, oftentimes we get kind of bogged down in semantics. Is there a clock in here anywhere? I am so sorry. This could end up being like 3 hours long. You know, I did whittle it down from 92 to 89 PowerPoint slides, so I think we're okay there. I think I carved out at least a half hour. But I don't know. I actually, oh, you know what I do? I have a cell phone. I'm not texting or anything. I'm just going to be looking at my clock, okay? So I want us to have a rational conversation tonight. When I use a word faith, when I use a word science, when I use a word evolution, I want us to know what we're talking about. Those of you that studied any form of logic know that the very first law of thought is the law of identity. Make sure that we're talking about the same thing in the same context. And so one of those words that I want us to see is this word faith. And I want to contrast tonight. We're going to go on a journey of a contrast between two famous atheists. On the right hand, we have the famous Oxford evolutionist Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has written several books, one of which is The God Delusion, is one of his hallmarks. And at a TED Talk in 2002 on militant atheism, he says this. He says, we're all atheists about most of the gods that societies have ever believed in. Some of us just go one God further. What do you think about that? We don't believe in these gods, Thor, unless you're an Avenger fan. We don't believe in these gods. And he just said, well, come on, guys, we're just going one God further. We don't believe in this Yahweh thing either. What do we do with that? He goes on to say in one of his books, he says, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. What word does he use twice there that I've boldened? Evidence. Contrast him as one of the young atheists with probably the father of the young atheist movement, Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew, his last book that he wrote in 2004, had the title, There Is a God, How the World's Most Prominent Atheist Changed His Mind. So I want to contrast these two, because listen to what Anthony Flew says. He says, we have all the evidence we need in our immediate experience, and that only a deliberate refusal to look is responsible for atheism at any variety. So no, hold on. Both of these men use the word evidence. So for us tonight, what I would like us to do, without getting way too deep and technical, but we're gonna have to wade a little bit into this. We're gonna use kind of science words, which is important. But if they're both using the word evidence, one saying it's the evidence that I don't have faith, and one saying all you have to do is look around, and the evidence is what caused me to lose my faith in atheism and switch it for deism, we probably should look at that evidence. You see, one of my heroes, I'll just tell you right now, is Anthony Flew. This is one of the who's who of atheism of the 20th century. He wasn't just a little atheist. He was a prominent atheist. And for him to realize that his life's work was wrong, we probably should look at the evidence. And some of us in this room tonight might be challenged by that evidence. Some of us in this room will be encouraged by that evidence. Because I, for one, as an organic chemist, when I see a beautiful structure like morphine, I look at that and go, oh my word, it's a form of worship for me. Just ask my organic students. I don't get reduced to tears, but I'm in awe. Some people do an opera, some do a sunset. I do the morphine structure. It's phenomenal. If I had a chalkboard, I'd draw it for you. It's so beautiful. Why is that? It's because when I look through the lens of science, I see him. It's how I worship. I love the lens of science. So let's jump into this. What is the word faith? A couple different definitions of the word faith, but the word tonight that we're going to be using for faith is this. It's the complete trust in the truthfulness of something. When we use the word faith, oftentimes faith is misused as a religious term, which is the way Dawkins is using it here. Faith merely means it's a trust in the truthfulness of something. You all are exhibiting great faith tonight in an engineer you know nothing about, who did a lot of work in a factory you don't even know about, and it's called the person who designed your chairs. Okay? So you're resting on the truth that that engineer got it right and knew what they were doing. That's faith. You are what? You are trusting in the truthfulness that those chairs will hold your weight. So the question then is, of this evidence, is it faith worthy? Which again is what we're going to flesh out tonight. The word science. Now we have to unpack this word. One of the things with science is this is a loaded word. There is science and there is science. Unfortunately, they both sound exactly alike. So when someone says, I believe in science, we need to say, what do you mean by that? When I was a kid, I remember my dad and my grandpa, his father-in-law, having this heated conversation over Martin Luther. As a kid, I remember just going, why are they were going round and round about this argument. I'm like, I don't get this. And it seemed like it went on forever. I'm sure it didn't. But as a young kid, I'm like, I don't get this. Well, it turns out, at the end of the argument, they realized one of them was talking about Martin Luther, and the other one was talking about Martin Luther King. So, of course, we're not going to agree on everything about the historical context of those two people. So one of the things we need to realize is just because I use the word science, I should stop and say, well, what do you mean by science? Just like faith. What do you mean by faith? What does that look like? Well, science is predicated on two things. One's objective and one is subjective. The objective is mathematics. In fact, one of the things I'm in awe over are mathematicians. Math is not a part of science. Math is before science. There has to be something that we can demonstrably demonstrate throughout the lab that's objectively true, and we call that mathematics. In fact, up here, you have the greatest equation ever to be formulated from the human mind. In that equation, you have most of physics and all of chemistry. That's how important that equation is. Some of you know it as the Schrodinger equation. That is a remarkable feat in the minds of man. That is before you get to science. We also have philosophy. It's where we get into the philosophical method or the scientific method. So before these two, we have to have philosophy and math. Math or mathematics is going to be the objective. The subjective is going to be the philosophical understanding. So here's where the two sciences come in. When we say science, the majority of people think of, well, of course, right? Periodic table, physics, of course, organic chemistry. We all think of organic chemistry when we talk about science because that's the greatest. Look at all those carbons. Aren't they beautiful? So when we look at this, but the question then is, what do we do and how is that different than when I show you something like that? Because that's also in the realm of science. So we need to talk about this. We need to flesh out this semantic issue. So here's the way it looks. When we are scientists, we use our five senses to look at the world around us, and we ask a question. And this is what we call the scientific method. And again, most of us in here will have seen some form of the scientific method. We ask a question, and then what do? Well, we do a little background research to say, did someone already ask this question and already do work on it? Because if they did, then I'm not going to repeat the wheel. All right, so then we ask the question, then we go ahead and we construct a hypothesis, and we test that hypothesis in the lab. So let's say I say to you, if you add sodium hydroxide and hydrochloric acid, it's going to get hot, and it's going to form water and salt. And you're like, I don't believe him. I don't believe him at all. What can you do? Well, you can go in the lab, and you can add hydrochloric acid to sodium hydroxide, and lo and behold, it gets hot and it's exothermic and blah, blah, blah. And you can do that test, okay? So you can confirm whether or not that question is true. Then what do? Well, from there, we analyze our data. Yeah, sure enough, it got hot, and sure enough, there was a salt in there with water, and then we typically are going to report our results, right? All looks great. There's science. That's how science works. But here's the problem. There are two realms of science. Notice this. There is science that talks about the now, or how things operate, and there is the then science, or the historical, the origin science, how things originated. Those are not the same scientific realm. In the one category we call the hard sciences, you have really cool things like getting people on the moon, right? There it is, penicillin, the greatest molecule of all time. Enzymes and their structure, right? Artificial hearts, and of course the iPad, right? Or iPod in this case, right? One of the greatest uses of bouncing electrons around silicone ever. right? All of that uses a very, very firm or testable form of science, okay? And then once we do that, we publish that in typical, my favorite journal article or journal is Journal of Organic Chemistry, of course, and other journals like that. Now notice on the other side of this crevice or this line here, you have historical science. This is the origin science. How did the cell originate? How did the eye originate? The brain originate? The man originate? You see the difference there? So when we do that, and we oftentimes see that in also scientific journals, but they're slightly different. Scientific America talks about how man evolved, or those are a different realm of science. Why? I love the philosopher Karl Popper. He helps us out a ton here, and he says this. He says, here is really what's going on. Here is the hallmark of what separates these two sciences. When we're talking about operational science, we can test that in the laboratory. So typically, you're going to think of your chemistries, your physics, okay, your engineering. When you're building a bridge, you can actually build that bridge in the lab and test its forces. When you start to talk about the origin of something, you have a very difficult, if not impossible, time doing what we call falsifying. How can you demonstrate that? How can you go into the laboratory and repeat that? If I told you that the eye occurred this way out of the warm pond, how are you going to duplicate that? And oftentimes we bog down in what we call just so stories. It's a great story. And just because I have a story of origins doesn't negate another story of origin. You could say in the beginning was nothing, exploded, and here we are. I could say in the beginning was someone, and he breathed and spoke, and here it is. A third person could say there was a great pink unicorn on another universe over, and he literally sneezed in the whole universe. You can't compare, or you can't disvalidate any of those stories. Now, the third one probably seems a little absurd, but the question you have to back up and say, which one of these has the most evidence, like we talked about, and am I going to bet my life on, which is what we're saying. So depending on my presuppositional stance, I see the data differently. So we have to be careful with these two realms of science. And what Anthony Flew said is very, very relevant here. He said this, insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. So we need to be really careful with these two realms of science. A few years ago, I had the privilege of debating a lady by the name of Eugenie Scott. And it was interesting in her debate, she kept going back and forth between operational science and origin science like they were the same thing, using the same word, and it gets confusing. Well, how could you disagree? I mean, you're anti-science? You're really anti-getting someone on the moon and penicillin? That sounds, no, I'm not anti-anything. That sounds great. What I want to do is say, what do we mean by science? So again, those two realms. So tonight, we're going to talk about science mostly in this realm, the origins realm. Does that make sense? Is that what we're tracking? Okay, if we're going to get sleepy or anything in here, let me know, because we'll take a nap, or we'll take a break, but we'll keep on moving, okay? So here's our word falsifiable. Now, here's our third loaded word for tonight, evolution. This is a big one. When someone uses the word evolution, it's so important for us to stop and say, wait. What do you mean by that? And personally, one of the things I challenge my college students with is, when you hear the word Christianity, do the same thing. What do you mean by that word? And I think one of the worst words that we use in our vocabulary is the word God. What do you mean by that word? I don't believe in God. Well, I might not either in the way you believe in it. Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing here, right? I don't believe in the big God, grandfather in the sky with the big beard, so let's be clear on what we mean by that. One of the words is evolution. There are three main definitions of this word. One of the loosest definition of it is change over time. And I personally have never met a scientist or a person who disagrees with this. Why? Because you can see it with your eyeballs. You look out there, birds changed. I mean, Darwin's finches, they changed on the Galapagos Islands, right? Check this out. Cats change, horses change, birds change, and yeah, phones change. And Porsches change. Look at that. Isn't that just sweet, right? I mean, there's where I grew up in the 80s with the poster on my wall, and look where we are today. You know, they change. There's nothing wrong with that. Things change. People change over time. That's not what we're talking about when we use that word. The second definition of it is descent with modification. What does that really mean? What descent with modification, we have to add a little bit to that. Do primates and reptiles share a distant common ancestor? What we're asking, is there some level of commonality between these? Now, this is a conversation and a question for a different night, not tonight. That is a good question, and that is a good issue to wrestle with, but that's still not what we're talking about. From that definition of evolution, you get grand stories. And I'll just tell you this, where these branch off is inference. And we could bog down in genetics and biology, but we're not going to do that tonight. Because what I want to do is I want to go one step further. When a scientist in a scientific lab is using the word evolution, they are not even typically using this one. Especially like a Richard Dawkins, here's what we are actually using. And I have to bring in one of my favorite persons of all time. This is Leibniz. If you don't know who Leibniz is, he was one of the polymaths of the 17th century. He was an absolute genius. In fact, he was one of the ones that invented calculus. Not only that, but he also had the sickest wig collection of the 17th century. I don't know what it was with these wigs, but that thing is legit. So with this whole thing, this man was an absolute genius. And he probably proposed the greatest question to ever be asked in philosophy, and that was this: why is there something rather than nothing? Let that sink in. Why is there something rather than nothing? And if you want to be consistent with your logic, if you start with nothing, what should you have 5 years later? Nothing. 10 years later? 1,000 years later? Billion years later? Gazillion years later? If you truly start with nothing to be consistent, you should still have nothing. But the problem is we don't have nothing, we have something. So where is the something out of the nothingness, and how does nothing give birth to something? Because in the beginning, you can't have nothing, you have to have something, because there is something today. So when Leibniz asked this question, it's a really profound question. And it typically bogs down, or it gets thrown out as, well, you guys believe in God, we just believe in the middle of nothing, it leapt into existence, there was a ripple, and the ripple exploded, and here we are. Okay, again, remember the two stories of how we got here? The question is, which one of those is logically consistent enough for me to say I believe that? I'm willing to bet my life that that is true. Because see, that's what Anthony Flew wrestled with, and that's what Richard Dawkins is doing. The question is, which of that evidence, as we're looking at tonight, is we're standing on? So in this question, here's the real working definition of evolution. Nothing to something to living to everything. That is really what we are talking about. How did we start with nothing, and in the nothingness something emerged, and the emergence of that something through quantum vacuum and gravity got together and brought all the particles together to form the novelty of the human and the human brain so that we could reason the question in the first place. That's a tall order. But that is the working definition in the scientific lab. There's no place in the science lab to infer a person in that. We have to figure it all out. Let's talk about that. So here's what it looks like. In the beginning was nothing, right here. And then it became a dot, about that big. That leapt into existence and somehow formed that. And then that somehow got together and formed that. And then that looked up into the world and said, wow, it's amazing how I got here by chance. That's pretty amazing. So what do we do with that? Well, here's what we're going to talk about. So you see, these are the stories that when we talk about evolution, we need to really be thinking about. How do we explain nothing to everything? And here's what we're going to really wrestle with tonight. I typically hear in the conversations and discussions and in debates a lot on cosmic evolution, right? Nothing to the Big Bang, to the solar systems, to Earth. The other side of that is I hear a lot on the biological side of evolution. And realize this, that biological, this is where Darwin kicks in. This is once we have to have an actual, and even this one, which has 480,000 base pairs to make it, even this one was parasitical, probably because this is the simplest known organism right here. But even this thing needed some help on the outside world. So the question is, Darwin, you can start to have the conversation here in biological evolution, but here's the problem. we have a huge gap here, and here's what it kind of looks like. You see, this is my specialty in my realm. This is what I love talking about. Why? Because I think until we answer the questions of chemical evolution, biological evolution doesn't stand a prayer. We don't even need to have that conversation. We need to get through how do we even have the reproducing cell in the first place before we can start talking about how we have population genetics and all these other things. So that's what we're going to talk about now. One of my heroes in science is Uwe Meyer-Heinrich. He says this in his book. This is a fantastic book. One of my personal areas of research is this whole issue of handedness in homochirality and organic, and I'm going to explain that to you all. It's great stuff, okay? And he is kind of the father of this area. And in his book, it was one of the better books written on this, he says the origin of life is abiogenesis, right? From non-living to living. Here's the little guys here living, and here's non-living. So we have to jump over this chasm. And he says the origin of life, abiogenesis, is one of the unsolved fundamental mysteries in modern natural science. The endeavor to discover some of its secrets continues to challenge researchers. It is the incapability to link chemical and biological evolution that continues to puzzle scientists. How can a mix of non-living chemicals be transformed into something as complex as the living cell? That's what he says right in his book. And he's a committed, very, very committed Darwinist. And he realizes, let's be honest, as chemists, that is the biggest question right there. How do we go from non-living to living? So let's talk about this middle ground here. Now, there's a lot to this, and I'll just tell you this. Each of these little blue boxes is probably a good 2 to 3 hour lecture. So in a context of an hour and a half, I was actually surprised when Jason told me that we had an hour and a half. I thought it was going to be like 40 minutes, so I was going to have to go through 91 slides really quickly. So now I can go a little bit slower. So tonight I had to kind of pick and choose, and I whittled it down. I got rid of reduced carbon, small organics, and polymerization because those are super cool, but we got to have something that we can land on tonight. So I picked two, homochirality and the DNA protein world. That's what we're going to focus on, two things over the next probably half hour. And then we'll land the plane with our two atheists, okay? So let's jump in. Let's talk about DNA and homochirality. Historically, science had three categories in which when I looked out at the world around me, when I looked at the data through my five senses, that I could categorize that sensory data coming in from my lab, from my research, from my eyes, from my ears, or whatever. The first one was this. It was a repeatable pattern, and we call those laws. So if you drop a pen, it falls. 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 What do you think is going to happen when I drop that pen again? It's going to fall, okay? It's predictable. It's reproducible. And so that's why you see this, AGCTREW, AGCTREW, AGCTR, and you can say, okay, I can predict the next one after this A. Why? Because it's probably going to be a GCT, because it's predictable. Those are patterns of law, and we see those throughout our senses when we look at the world around us. And we simply call that law. Whether it's gravity, whether it's some form of force vectors, whether it's thermodynamics, all of those are repeatable. Those are all laws. The law of thermodynamics is one that I teach my students all the time, okay, at least in GChem, not in organic. But what do we do with that? Well, that's a law. It's repeatable. We can use that because we know it's going to be true the next time I go to do it. That's just simply a law. The second category in which we can look at the data is just a random event. And notice this, you can't predict what the next one's going to be. NAPEP, you have no idea what's going to come next. Why? Because it's just random. And you can look out and you can see there's just random. The pebbles in the bottom of the ocean, the clouds, or the veins in the sand from wind. So this works? And we have that. We just look out in the world and that's just what it is. But there's a third category. Stay with me. And the third category is the one that's under assault. And here's what it looks like. Because chemistry is so amazing, I love the periodic table, you're pulling out something very different with that than those other ones. This is what we call hallmarks of design. Okay? I can read that, and we're going to get into semiotics tonight. Trust me, it's good stuff. So when I look at this design inference, what happens from that? Well, I look out at the world around me, and it doesn't take long that I start to see that there are certain stones in the bottom of the riverbed that look different than others. There are rocks stacked up on the Boise River that don't look natural. There are rocks in South Dakota that don't look natural. There's a new national park going in. It's the backside, and I think that's always pretty cool. Okay. So, never gets old. It's not real, actually. Be cool, though. But you get the point, right? You look at that, and you begin to see, okay, there's something special about the simplicity, but there's a hallmark of something in that I need to recognize. It's something different. And we had a category, which was called design. It wasn't a big mysterious thing. But here's what happened. Here's the aha of this and why we're going through this. The original Greeks and those who wrestled with the great ideas and the great what-ifs and why is there something rather than nothing and coming up with this, they believed that the world, there was an order to it. There was a rational intelligence to it, okay? They called this the Logos. And so the most fulfilled life was one lived in agreement with the Logos. That was the historical context of that. So when you see this, it was no surprise through the lens of science. Now, even someone like Isaac Newton, and Isaac Newton, again, was one of the most brilliant scientists, said this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as the Lord over all. Isn't that cool? And you know one of the things looking at Isaac Newton, just to be honest with you, he looks a lot like David Coverdale. You ever notice that? I don't know, that's just something, those of you that grew up in the 80s probably know what I'm talking about, but it's kind of cool. So here's what happened. Historically, here's what science looked like. Science was an activity with a goal. Stay with me. It was an activity with a goal. The activity was going out, using my 5 senses, using the scientific method to do what? To discover truth about the world around me. That was exciting. And that's what caused literally the scientific revolution. When science exploded, because man realized that, whoa, there's a rational order here. If I follow that rational mind, then things make sense. Super cool. Science exploded. Even Whitehead says, yep, if it wouldn't have been for the Christian mind of the Logos concept, science wouldn't have been what it is today. And that's historically what the historians say of science. And Whitehead is not anywhere near a theist. Thinking God's thoughts after him. As Einstein said, why didn't Einstein say it? Oh, sorry. I'm looking up here. Sorry about that. I'm having so much fun up there, and it's over here. Einstein said this, I want to know God's thoughts. The rest are details. Okay? There's our great deist right there saying, I want to know God's thoughts, the rest are details. So even great minds have realized that when we look out, there is this order, there's this rational, there is this, again, this activity with a goal. But here is one of the things I want us to take home tonight. The paradigm shift that happened, where we shifted from science to what we call today modern science, here is the aha of that moment. Modern science says this, and this happened in the mid-19th century. When Darwin published his book on the origin of the species, looking at a few finch birds, what the aha of that moment was this. Not that we came from apes, not that we whatever. This was the big deal, that there was a paradigm shift in science. You see, science had these 3 categories in which it could look at the world and discover new truths about the world around us. What Darwin brought to the table and what he brought to philosophy and the scientific minds of his day, remember, 19th century, mid-19th century, that when you have natural selection and random mutations working together, they mimic design. In other words, law and chance working together mimic design. Therefore what? We no longer need the category of design. And the paradigm shift that happened in the mid-19th century to move science from historical science or classical science to modern science was this shift. And so design was removed from a category in which I could look rationally at the world around me. All of my scientific understanding had to come now through the lens of law and chance working together. But here's the problem with that. When did that occur? Mid-19th century. What was going on in the mid-19th century? Well, let's talk. Chance. Jacques Monod, the great French biologist, Nobel laureate, said, "Man knows at last that he is alone in the universe's unfeeling immensity, out of which he emerged only by chance." Chance alone is the source of all novelty, all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, only chance. Absolute but blind liberty is at the root, absolute but blind liberty is at the root of the prodigious, I should have read that before, edifice that is evolution. What do we do with that? Well, notice the design thing. Here's our buddy Richard Dawkins. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Appearance, right? We don't need design. Because why? We have these two working together. Francis Crick said it this way. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why is that so important? Because what we need to realize is this, the lens of science today has it's a different game. And here's what happened. The activity with the goal is no longer with us. We now have a game with a rule. Listen to this. Historically, it was an activity with a goal. The goal was to discover truth. The activity was to just go out and use your senses and discover the world, discover the truths and the beauties through science. But there's a paradigm shift. Now we have a game with a rule, and we cannot violate that rule and be called scientific. What is the rule? The game is still the scientific method, but the rule is what we call methodological naturalism. MD, methodological naturalism. Big buzzword that basically says, I can only use my five senses and the interacting particles of nature to explain everything. Now, remember when this theory originated? The mid-19th century. What was going on, 19th century? What was going on there? Well, if you look at this, I'm going to pass up on that one. When you look at the 19th century, here's what was going on. Here's chemistry in the 19th century. Okay, that was a spectrometer. Here's transportation. Here's the cell phone. Here is our understanding of the cell, literally called cytoplasmic bags of goo. That was the scientific term. 1850s. 1859 is when Origin of the Species was published. We had an entire paradigm shift in science based on that technology. And here's why we're having problems today. Because when we begin to look through our microscopes and our electron microscopes, and we begin to see the world of the cell and what's going on inside the cell and the trillions of cells that make up organisms, we're realizing that I have to explain all of this through these two alone. Do you see where we're going with this? The paradigm shift in science is that now when I look through the microscope, now when I look into the lab, everything has to be run through law and chance. So we had a definition change. And we confined discovery to methodological naturalism. So now all of my discoveries have to go through that lens. And here's where we're running into problems. When we had historical science, we had something big enough to contain and explain life. But when the paradigm shift occurred, all of a sudden we now had to figure out how to explain life through the confines of a narrower worldview. Everything has to fit in the box of methodological naturalism. And maybe in the mid-19th century, the optimism was there. Let's do it. We can do this. We can do it. We can use, remember, humanism? Man can do this. Let's use this and we'll get it done. We'll explain all this. And there was this huge optimism. We don't need the church. We don't need anything of God. We've got this and these, and we can do it. So here's where this rub is happening. When I look at these three lenses, I begin to see that, well, wait a minute. Even as I'm having my soup during lunch, and I dip my spoon down into that bowl of soup, and out emerges something that says, "Are you happy?" I scratch my head and I say, well, that's kind of a coincidence. And then what do I do as a statistician? I get into the probabilities, and I get into this whole conversation about statistics, right? And what's the probability of that happening? And we bog down in that. Like, well, it's probably, well, if you have an infinite number of universes, at some point my spoon's going to spell that in my soup, so therefore I'm in the right universe to have that in my soup that morning. Or you're looking up in the clouds on your way home from the ocean, and all of a sudden you see, whoa. And you're like, that is so cool how those clouds just form that. You see, what we're doing here is we're entering into the realm that's going to challenge us and hopefully be encouraging to some of you in this room. We call this semiotics. This is a study of how do we use figures and illustrations to portray meaning in messages. How many think they know what that word is? Okay. How many of you know that you probably aren't thinking the word I'm thinking? This word is Gift. Can you pronounce that? Gift. Gift in German means poison. Gift. Yeast, say that. Yeast is Norwegian for marriage. Same word. What do we think that is? A present, right? So the question is it poison? Is it a present? Or is it marriage? And how would we know? Because those are very, very different. And this is what we call semiotics. See, semiotics need four things. They need a sender of the message, okay? And there's a receiver. So the sender knows the characters, knows how to manipulate the paint, if you will, knows how to manipulate the characters. There's an agreement between the sender and the receiver of how that's received. And what do we do in the middle? We use a message and a medium. You tracking with me? This is what we do every single day. It's what Apple has made gazillions of dollars doing. You are the receiver of something you have to have, and so the message and the medium come through these cool things called iPods and iPhones and iPads. It's part of our culture. It's part of our society. It's part of the way we're wired. Why are we going into semiotics in this whole conversation? Because here's the cool part. When you see this sender, message, medium, receiver, you are entering into a realm of semiotics. And here's what we know from all of science. A message and a medium to a receiver is always sent by a sender. Messages and mediums to receivers don't just happen in a vacuum by chance and random processes. In principle, intrinsic to science, they don't happen. Just because I moved ink around on the screen, or in this case, light on the screen, or spray painted on the wall, which Pastor Wolin would not like, there's something not in the ink, not in the particles, not in the clouds. There's information portrayed using the particles, but it takes an intelligent source to send it and an intelligent source to receive it. Some of you probably have seen that great movie, Contact, with Jodie Foster. What is she doing when she sits there on her hood? Bum, 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 bum. You know the part, right? What's happening? How does she know that the prime numbers are coming in from deep space? Because it's not a normal pattern. Law and chance produce normal patterns. When it's anormal, it's coming from a sender. You see what's going on here? You see where we're going with this, I hope? This is where it gets really exciting. It's good stuff, and we're about a third of the way through, so hang in there. So, here's our guy with the sick haircut again, or the sick wig, Leibniz. Now, one of the geniuses about Leibniz, again, one of my heroes scientifically and philosophically, he is the inventor of this thing called binary code. Now, binary code, let's just be honest, is one of the coolest things ever, all right? All of us are products of binary code, so let's explain it. Let's talk about it, and let's see how cool this really is. Binary code is very simple. It's up and down or on and off, okay? We use light switches. This light switch would be on, this would be off. On, off, that's all we do. My own research, when I used to do organic chemistry, was making photomolecules that would go on and off, and I was doing little tiny switches at the molecular level. Kind of cool, kind of geeky, but that's what I used to do. Now, We've seen this and we've used this. We have this thing called the Morse code. Now, here's the way the Morse code works. Notice this. We use a dash and a wedge. That's an on and an off. That's a 1 and a 0. That's binary. Okay, 2, binary, 2. So here's what it looks like. If I see a dash, dot, dash, dot, all right, look for it, dot, dash, dot, dash, dot. Okay, so that's a C. If I do a dot, 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 that's an H, okay. Oh, I love the E because it's just a dot, right? And some of you actually that got your ham radio's license had to go learn these things. I didn't. I got my ham, but I'm after the Morse code part. Okay, and you can see where it's going. M is the dot, dot, the I, and you can see what's going on here. And over time, what do? We spelled the greatest word of all time, chemistry, okay? You see how this works, though? Are we tracking with how we use that to portray a message? Notice, sender, receiver, through a message in a medium. This is what binary code was. But here's the cool part. When we start to talk about bits in the computer, watch how this works. Watch how computers work. Watch how the genius of Leibniz in the late 17th century, late 17th century on, or late, yeah, right in through there. Watch this. If you only have a 1 and a 0, you only have the possibility of two things, right? A 1 or a 0. So if I'm going to code with just that, just what we call a 1 bit, you don't get very far. So if I'm going to go from language 1, which is 1s and 0s, to a new language, let's say I want to be able to spell the alphabet, all 26 characters. We tracking? So I want to use 1s and 0s to spell 26 letters in the alphabet. How do we do that? This is how computers work, all right? Well, there's a couple different ways. First off, I could just say for every time that I have a 1 and a 0, I could just assign the 1 or the 0 as one letter. And all I get out of that are 2 letters. That's not enough to get to 26. So that would be a 1-bit system. Well, let's go up to a 2-bit. Now, 2-bit says, okay, I use a combination of a 1 and a 0, or 0 and a 0, 1 and a 1, or 1. You get the point. I use 2. Okay, well, with that, I still have a 0 and a 0, 0, 1, and I only have a possibility of 4. I need to get to 26 if I'm going to do the alphabet. So let's go on up, let's skip on up to a 4-bit system. Well, now I can do 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, etc. But you still see what's going on here? What happened? I'm still short. I can get to 16 doing that, but I can't get to my 26 letters of the alphabet. So what do you think I'm going to do next? Yeah, you got it. Go to 8 or 6. Let's go to 6. So here at 6, I can do 64 bits, and I can do a 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. And notice this. I have 64 possibilities. I only needed 26, so I can do the entire alphabet. Isn't that kind of cool? So the original computers, like the Commodore 64, used what we call the 8-bit system, 8-bit binary system, all right? When we go to 16, which is a few years ago, we had 65,000. Today, most of the computers that you're using are 32-bit. Okay, that's like 4 billion possibilities. We have more than just a 26, so now we can do colors and we can do all kinds of cool things in that. And someday we're going to go to 64. There are a few out there that are 64, but for the most part, we're all at 32, okay? So what you see with this, let's back up and go to 8-bit. And you're like, what in the world? Are we talking about Anthony Flew? Yeah, hang on there, okay? So here's the way this works. Here's the binary code of the way the Commodore 64 works that Pastor Wolin uses in his office. It's on your tagline, isn't it? I love that. That's a classic one. It's like I typed this on my Commodore 64. Pretty cool. So when you see these characters, they all have a binary code. And here's the way we do this. Just like we had a C for binary code using just ones and or dashes and wedges, now we can say if I have a C, it's a 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1. Boom, that's a C. If I want to code for an H, I'm going to go with a 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. You get the point? And this is how computers actually work. So the computer was programmed with 1s and 0s, so when you type, a C was on the screen, an H was on the screen, an E was on the screen, and what was it doing? It was using this as its code. And so you can see how this coded for the word chemistry just using 1s and 0s. Are we tracking? Yeah, big yawn, like, yeah. Okay. And I'm going to land the plane. So here's where the rub is, and here's where it gets exciting to me. Here's where Richard Dawkins and Anthony Flew diverge. Watch what happens. Let's say that we came up with a brand new code. Let's just say that instead of a binary code, let's say that we came up with this novel code, and let's call it a ternary code. Now, ternary just means 4. So let's say that instead of using 1s and 0s, I'm going to use 4 characters in this code. And let's say that code uses just randomly 4 letters of the English language. Let's use an A, G, a C, and a U in our new ternary code. Stay with me. All right? And let's say our new language doesn't have 26 letters. Let's say it has 20 letters. I know some of you are like, I know where he's going with this. Okay, so it has 20 letters in our new alphabet, and we only have 4 that we need to code for. So we're going to go from language 1, which is A, G, C's, and U's, just like our language 1 was 1s and 0s with binary. And now I'm going to go to language 2, which is this new alphabet that only has 20, doesn't have 26. So the question is, how many of these redundancies of these in bits do I need to code for my new language? And here's what it looks like. If I just took a 1-bit ternary code, I could only code for an A, C, D, and an E, and I would have to stop there. Not enough. All right, let's go ahead and go to a 2-bit ternary code, and you can see automatically quickly we jumped up to 16. It took us a lot longer with binary. All right, so with 2-bit ternary code, I can still only get to 16 letters, and I have 4 left because I need 20. So let's go ahead and go with a 3-bit ternary code and watch what happens. Now all of a sudden I'm at 64. How many did I need? 20. So now I have complete redundancy and places for others that I could reassign if those are the only ones I needed. Now here's where it gets amazing. When I take this fictional code that we just came up with, like Leibniz, and I begin to look and overlay this into the reality of the world around us, here's what it looks like. Let's take a random event that we think is just random sequence of these C, G's, A's, and U's. And so here's my language, and let's start at August, because August is the first month of the school year, so that's a great place to start. And from then on out, let's go ahead and define each of these as in my new ternary 3-bit code. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to need a Rosetta Stone on this case because we need to translate from one language to the other. So I'm going to translate from this language to my new language up here. Now watch what happens. So I go to my UGC, and I go my UGC, and you can see right here it codes for C right there. Okay, so I put that in my language. And I go to my CAC right here, and that codes for H. Pretty cool. And then I go to GAA, and it codes right here for the E. Okay. And AUG is my green one over here, but it also is the M up here. And my AUA right here codes for AUA. See it right there? So the I and the S and the T and the R and the Y. So I used my new code to code for the same words that we've been coding for all night. Whether it comes through Morse, whether it comes through binary, or now whether it comes through my new system of a ternary code that's a 3-bit system. You're like, what's this such a big deal? Some of you will recognize this alphabet. This alphabet right here is the alphabet responsible for all life. From fungi to humans, we all share the same alphabet. The same alphabet spells all of us. And just as you see a rational word coming out of that sequence, what we are learning through the lens of the microscopes when we look into this is that code is very specific. It's a language. It's like someone wrote the code for what humans should look like, and what cats should look like, and what foxes should look like. Fascinating. And so you see what happens here is language 1 is found down in the cell. It's the cell's nucleus in what we call DNA. And language 2 is out here where these enzymes and proteins make up the complexity and the inner workings of all cells, all life. And what happens from this, as we begin to see the complex machinery that goes into the programming of this, we have the code coming in from our ternary 3-bit code. And this complex little machine is spitting out these complex molecules. Those complex molecules then begin to organize into cells and cellular structures and do work inside the cells. And all of these little cartoons here are these complex words. And that then begins to get bigger until finally it gets really big. And so you have to stop and ask yourself the question, that's pretty cool how chance with no mind produced something pretty amazing that could actually go in and invent binary code. Remarkable. But it even gets trickier. This is just scratching the surface. You see, we haven't even talked about homochirality yet. And that's my passion. Just ask my organic students. I love homochirality. Okay, so here are the 20 amino acids that make up all life, from fungi all the way up to us. But you see, let's just take one simple amino acid, the A on our alphabet. This A has the ability to exist in two forms. Okay? It has a form that we call left-handed, and it has a form that we call right-handed. Just like your left hand and your right hand are different, you can never get your left hand to be your right hand and your right hand to your left hand, ever. Ever. These molecules have a handedness to them. There's a left-handed and there's a right-handed. Stay with me. This is so huge in the question of how do you go from non-life to life. You see, our noses know the difference. If I drew up two versions of Carvone up here, this is Carvone and this is Carvone. They look similar, don't they? They're just mirror images of one another. Your nose would know that this Carvone, or Sinister, or S Carvone, left-handed Carvone, smells like dill pickles. Okay, so if you smelled that in the lab, you would actually smell, it smells like dill pickles. That's the smell of dill. But if you smelled right-handed Carvone, or R Carvone, it smells like mint. So our noses can distinguish between these hands. But here's the weird thing, and the thing that blows us away when we're honest at the chemistry lab. Chemistry doesn't know the difference. Chemistry cannot select between those two. Trust me, this is my active area of research. This is a huge problem. You see, what this is saying is, let's say this left-handed form was a capital A and the right-handed form was a lowercase a. So when I bring in this alphabet, what I should have are two sets of alphabets. I should have a capital A set of alphabets, and I should have a lowercase set of alphabets, or letters. The two of them. And chemistry cannot select between those two. So here's what should happen. If I'm going to make in my primordial slime with no mind, no rational, nothing, just the laws of chemistry and the laws of physics. There's no mind. There's no rationality. There's nothing out there. It's just the laws of chemistry acting on the molecules. And in that world, what I should get when I start to spell things is a word that looks like this. But here's what absolutely blows us away. We don't see this. And this is the fundamental problem of all of chemistry. Where did selectivity originate? Because once you have a living system, you can differentiate. But it takes a one-handed organism to differentiate between a left and a right. And we have to build that thing up. So here's what we're trying to say. You don't have that alphabet. When you look out through the science lab, you only have left-handed amino acids. How? Chemistry can't select. When I do this experiment in the laboratory, I do what's called a racemic mixture. I get 50-50 equal. We're not talking 49-51. We are talking 50.0000 and 50.0000. It takes great effort to try to get one over the other. There's actually a whole journal called Tetrahedron Asymmetry where we're trying to figure this out, how I can rationally impose a handedness. But what I need to back up and say, wait a minute, if I'm talking about nothing to something to everything, where did this originate? It's not just the semiotics of information. It's a huge problem of the homochirality of the information. Because here's what it looks like. That. And we have no answer. of how that happened. Oh, we have speculations. And the leading speculation, I kid you not, wait for it, is extraterrestrial seeding. E.T. did it. And I could go in another hour lecture on how that's impossible, but we'll save that for another night and bore you with that. Now, all of the molecules in your body are either left-handed exclusively or right-handed exclusively. All the amino acids that make up all the proteins in all life are all left-handed. All of the sugars that are used within your body in the context of energy are right-handed. The DNA, the base pairs that make up DNA are all right-handed, no left-handed. We live in a world that is exclusively either left-handed or right-handed, but not a mixture like we should see if chemistry was the one responsible for synthesizing by random chance in the warm little pond. And you are now entering into the realm of why it is that you had the leading atheist of the 20th century scratching his head and saying, hold on, I am wrong. Think of the humility of that statement. First, for him to admit that, man, my whole life's work, when I'm seeing coming in from science and my personal philosophy, and they're not jiving, he didn't say, well, science has got to be wrong. He looked with the humility and said, my philosophy must be wrong. That's a remarkable moment, I believe, which is why I use him to showcase that. Where do we go with this? Well, here's what I want you to see. We use only capital letter alphabet in all of life. That's it. So when we start to see a rational sentence, an irrational word that makes up a sentence, that makes up a paragraph, that makes up a chapter, that makes up a book, that makes up a book of a volume of books, etc., etc., you start to see that this is not a place for chance and law to work. And scientists like Anthony, or he's a philosopher, but scientists are beginning to scratch their head and say, well, wait a minute, we're being confined to this methodological naturalism, but we don't have a category in which this fits. Chemistry doesn't fit into law. Chemistry doesn't fit into chance. But we've defined science in a way that we have no place to put it, which is why you have people like Richard Dawkins writing books that say, climbing Mount Improbable. Because I have to figure this out with only chance and law. Or we need a new paradigm shift in science, back to the way it was. Now that's kind of weird. Go back to go forward. So here we go. Here is a code that we're all comfortable with. Here's a code we're just now beginning to explore and understand. We know that this thing is producing some pretty cool creations, all with ones and zeros. We know, my goodness, click happy here. We know that this produces some amazing creatures. We also know the laboratory in which this came out. Bell Labs and some of the original work in trying to flesh all this out. And we also know the lab that this one came out of. See a disconnect here? Yeah. You see why someone like Anthony Flew says, hold on. Something's amiss here. Something's wrong at the core level. So when you have these two men that look at the evidence, and the one says, I have faith in spite of the evidence, or because, or lack of the evidence. And the other says, no, just look at the evidence. You can't be a consistent atheist. What's going on? Well, put it in Anthony Flu's own words. My one and only piece of relevant evidence, there's our word again, for an Aristotelian God is the apparent impossibility of providing a naturalistic theory of the origin from DNA of the first reproducing species. You see, this is in principle a problem. We don't get information out of chance and law. They don't work. This had to have come from some source that we yet to explain, probably aliens. The only reason which I have for beginning to think of believing in a first cause God is the impossibility of providing a naturalist account of the origin of the first reproducing organism. He says in his book, There is a God. I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that the universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. I started the night saying this is going to challenge some of you. It's also going to encourage some of you. This should be challenging. I think, like no time in history, the science labs are screaming of something amazing. They're shouting it when we let it speak. But when I confine it to a game with a rule, I'm losing the beauty of the activity and letting the activity lead us into truth. Habermas asked Anthony Flew an interesting question. And that was, when you start to look at this methodological naturalism, when you start to bring methodological naturalism, say, I've got to fit everything into this box, the question becomes, is the box big enough? You see, historically, what did we have? Well, we had a pretty big box. And we're having a hard time getting it to fit in the box. But we're going to get it to work. Just keep working at it. It'll go. Or is it time for scientists to look back and say, wait a minute, maybe it's the wrong box? Habermas asked Anthony Flew in one of the last interviews before he passed away. I asked this last question with a smile, Tony, but just think what would happen if one day you were pleasantly disposed toward Christianity and all of a sudden the resurrection of Jesus looked pretty good to you. You want to know what he said? This is what he said, not that. Well, one thing I'll say, Jesus is an enormously attractive, charismatic figure. Now, to our knowledge, Anthony Flew never became a theist. He died a deist, as far as we know. But here's the interesting thing. He saw this Jesus as an enormously attractive figure. Do you know what John calls Jesus in John 1:1? This gets me so excited. Here's John, the beloved, introducing his Savior. And John doesn't just come in and dance around. Because I think if I were writing that, I said, in the beginning was truth. Man, that makes a lot of sense, right? Some other might have said, in the beginning was love. But you know what John does? He says, in the beginning was the Logos, the Word. What? And the Word became, walked with us, spoke with us. This enormously attractive person is the embodiment and the face of all truth. And if you believe in Jesus tonight, what I'm going to challenge you with is what Paul challenges us with in Colossians 1, where he says this: all things were created by Jesus and for Jesus. Now, if you back up and understand what Paul is saying there, that means that every particle in the known universe was created by Jesus and is for Jesus. Jesus is huge. That's my Jesus. That's the Jesus that I fall in love with every time I go into the lab and I see one of these molecules. That's the Jesus I see when I look honestly through the lens of science. Because I don't see a conflict. I don't see a war between science and faith. What I see is the way back to letting science become a director of truth. When we let the general creation speak of him. What did Paul tell us in Romans 1? They suppress the truth. You've got to constantly suppress the truth. And they exchange the glory of an incorruptible God for the image of man. My whole problem of life is getting in the way. I want to get out of the way and allow him to be God. Because I believe he will. And I believe the Logos loves each and every one of you. And I believe he has a plan for each and every one of you. And I believe each and every one of you is special because of that plan. And my prayer tonight, as we've gone into science, and hopefully I know it bogged down in some very, very deep genetics and chemistry, but my prayer is this, that you don't leave here changed. You don't leave here either challenged or encouraged. Because when I begin to see the eyes of this Jesus, I begin to look into my Logos, and I begin to understand his voice, he becomes an absolute amazing person. Let's pray. Lord God, tonight I just thank you for this time together. I thank you for you as truth. I thank you for your glory. Father, I ask that your kavod, your glory, be restored into this world around us. Father, I'm so sorry that we've hijacked your glory, your beauty, for the image of us and birds and lizards. You are an awesome God. You're a holy God. You're a loving God. And tonight I ask as a congregation, as a body, what privilege it is to stand here at Pastor Wallen's pulpit and speak of you. Because you are all truth. You are the really real. I ask that you would challenge us tonight and that we would not leave this place unchanged. That you, as living truth, through the power of your Spirit, would either be knocking on our hearts or surrounding our hearts with your love. Thank you for science. Thank you for truth. Thank you, Jesus, that you have given us through the lens of what has been made so that we are without excuse. You are who you said you are. And I love you tonight for that. Go with us, Jesus, please. Be glorified in your name. Amen.
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming out this evening. Yeah, go ahead. We are just super thankful for Tim coming out, and please, if you have, there are implications to these things, aren't there? I mean, there are implications. This is the greatest question that anyone can ask. Where did we come from? Right? And if the answer is we came from God, there's implications to that, giant implications. And so if you have questions about that, maybe your worldview has been challenged this evening, ask. Come up, ask Tim, ask myself, what do I need to do now? Where does truth come from? And so we want to help with that. So please take advantage of just some time afterwards to come up and ask some questions. If your worldview has been challenged, if you want to know further, what's a book to read, we would probably have some suggestions for that. So anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. This is kind of our first Wednesday forums where we kind of once a month we'll have a talk that we work through. Next month's topic is actually on gender issues, on homosexuality. So come out for that if you are interested, and we will discuss that issue. So we try to pick a topic every month that's relevant to our culture, but is kind of difficult to talk about on Sunday morning for whatever reason, doesn't fit quite as well. We don't have enough time to talk about it. So that's the idea of these first Wednesday talks. So next month, come out for that. You are dismissed.